Great, thank you. I'm glad you did that, not me. Thank you, Dr. Colon, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to you. The topic that I want to talk about is preventing unregulated commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, but I'd like to point out that in his day job, Ambassador Bolton is in fact the chair of the negotiations that I will be talking about, and perhaps it would be better if you'd given this talk rather than me, but anyway, I shall proceed. I'd like to begin with my conclusion. I think that major jurisdictions of the world have the opportunity to avoid a major potential disaster of the ecosystem before it happens. This would be novel. Normally we deal with things after there's a problem. So let me talk about the driver. This has been the topic of the last couple of days, but I'm sensitive to the fact that the people who are online might not have seen that yesterday. A lot of work in terms of the changing ice patterns in the Arctic. This is from the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment of the Arctic Council, which was prepared several years ago. Summer sea ice extent in 1979, summer sea ice extent in 2003. 2 points, admittedly, but in 2012, as we've heard yesterday, really the lowest extent of summer sea ice ever recorded, and the difference between 79 and 2012 to 2009 was the yellow line. We also saw yesterday that this year is shaping up to be pretty similar to 2012. The blue line is the ice at the present point in time, the dotted line being 2012. So some expectation that there will be similar circumstances. I would like to point out, however, that the sea ice extent is the extent of sea ice that is less than 15% cover. That's because of resolution questions. 15% ice cover is a lot. 10% is a lot. So there are still clearly some operational issues there. In terms of what I'm talking about, what is the issue? Well, around the world, and this is where I begin to try to put on top of what we see from the physical environment, the legal environment, and approaches to managing the oceans. Around the world, there are a number of maritime anomalies from a spatial point of view, which are referred to as being high seas enclaves. This is where the exclusive economic zone of one or several countries, that 200 nautical mile limit, which is also the exclusive fishing zone, where they come together and create a hole in the middle. They surround an area that is the high seas. There are a number of them around the world, but there are a number in northern marine areas that are quite significant. This is from Professor Zilanov. He provided this to me nicely, that he presented this at the Glacier Conference last couple of years. There are a number of known enclaves that I'd like to point out. They have very interesting names. The banana hole, the loop hole, the polygon, which actually is a high seas area surrounded completely by Russian EEZ, and the donut hole off in the Siberian, off Alaska. I'd like to not talk about them all, but the Central Arctic Ocean is one of these, but it happens to be the biggest. Now, the donut hole has played a very significant role in the economy and in the environment of a number of countries. The donut hole, which I will, if I can get this to work here. So here we have the boundary between the United States and Russia. And when you superimpose on that the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, driven by the Aleutian Islands here, driven by the geography of Russia here, this is the donut hole. The high seas, therefore not under the control of the coastal state. and for the longest time significant fishing in that area of pollock by fleets from Asia, by fleets from as far away as Poland. And what happened is that the total stock was demolished. In 1987, 1.7 million tons of pollock were caught. 1992, 10,000, which led to negotiations to deal with the issue, which ended up with an agreement in 1993 after the problem. And I'm told, looking at the data, that in fact the stocks have not come back. This is a disaster that was greater than the, from an environmental point of view, than the northern cod off the eastern coast of Canada and the United States. I think the objective is to avoid this in the Central Arctic Ocean. So what's happening in the Central Arctic Ocean? Here we have a number of maps that many of you will have seen. I'm grateful to the Pew Charitable Trust who provided these to me. What we see here are the 5 coastal states, the United States, Russia, Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark because of Greenland, and Canada. The red line is the exclusive economic zone, so that this is the Greenland, Canada, and so on. And in the middle, the area with the lines, the high seas. And what we see, excuse me, that should have been this one. Behind it, the white, is the ice conditions that we normally expect. And so the high seas have been covered by ice, therefore not accessible, particularly by fishing trawlers and so on. This is the situation in 2012, and what we see is that the geographic extent is quite variable, and in particular the Pacific sector of the Central Arctic Ocean is opening up, accessible through the Bering Strait. Now, if we take the notional fishing depth up to 2,500 meters, which is the yellow, in other words, where it would be physically feasible to fish effectively, and we put all of that together, in 2012, and one would expect this year as well, a significant area where fishing could have taken place, even for a short amount of time. Now, the ecosystem is very, very, very fragile. And in particular, the species of Arctic cod, Borregogus saida, is central to the ecosystem of the Arctic in terms of marine mammals, in terms of the polar bears and the seals, and therefore of communities. Take out the base of this in significant numbers, namely the Arctic cod, and my point is that the whole ecosystem could collapse. That's, I think, the level of the challenge here. So you might say to me, well, Peter, this is a long way away. Well, Poland was fishing in the Donut Hole. China and others are fishing off in the Southern Ocean to catch krill that is then used for fish meal in aquaculture. 70% of aquaculture in the world is done in China. In fact, the Western Arctic, actually we should say the Pacific sector of the Arctic, because in Russia it's the Eastern Arctic, it's 1/3 closer to Asia than the Southern Ocean. So this issue, there's been a fair bit of pressure, began with pressure from the science community. Back in 2010, concerns were raised about this issue at the International Polar Year Science Conference in Oslo. 2011, 2,000 scientists signed an open letter saying to governments, look, you should do something about this. And then in 2012, we highlighted this at the International Polar Year Conference in Montreal, which I had the privilege of chairing, and we were able to make this a bit of an issue. But there have already been actions in North America to deal with this. And in particular, and this is before the scientists, Public Law number 243, which is, I think, supported and promoted by Alaska Senator, former Ted Stevens, and others, is a real call to do something about this, which I think is, I don't understand Washington. I know you do. But clearly this public law has played an important role. So in 2010, the United States, you put a hold on commercial fishing in the Arctic Management Area in the Arctic. And sometime late in 2014, Canada announced the Beaufort Sea Management Framework in co-management with the Inuvialuit of the Canadian Western Arctic. There were actions by the 5 coastal states led by the ambassador, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and USA, to come up with an agreement. In 2014, in Nuuk, Greenland, a consensus that was a need to do something, which is always a good beginning if you can agree to do something. And then in 2015, the signing of the Oslo Declaration. Now, I'm going to be totally simplistic about this because I'm not a lawyer. Basically, what this agreement says from the Arctic 5 is that we will not allow our fleets to fish in the high seas, international waters of the Central Arctic Ocean, until such time as there's a sufficient scientific base and a management regime is in place. Now, as it happens, none of us have any fleets that could actually go in there effectively. But those are, I think, the 2 key points to take out: the science and management. We've seen a fair bit of political will around this. Now, politics, of course, is changing. Our Prime Minister, Trudeau, and President Obama called for a binding agreement in the CAO. There's been a change in that duo. Then President Xi of China and President Obama said that this should be worked towards regulating potential unregulated fishing. At least 2 of those leaders are still around, so maybe there's hope that this will continue. And so this has led to multilateral negotiations once again, and Ambassador Bolton has been leading. Why? Well, the jurisdictions that have fleets that are capable of fishing in that area are Japan, China, Korea, the European Union, and Iceland. And so the Arctic 5, if I can call them that, have been meeting with these countries to develop a similar agreement to the one that already exists from the Oslo Declaration. Similar, but obviously different. So a number of meetings that have been taking place, a couple in Washington, D.C., one in Iqaluit, in Nunavut, Tórshavn, Reykjavik, and an upcoming one, which I'm told by the ambassador is still, the date is still being set. My view is that there is real potential optimism that this will come into place. At the same time, scientists from the 10 jurisdictions have been sitting down at meetings and saying, okay, what are some of the science questions? What do we really need to know? We know very, very little about this area. And for the simple reason, we've not actually been able to go in there other than with heavy icebreakers. And that will still be the case for quite a while. So the next meeting will be in Ottawa in October to deal with data issues. We've had a series of parallel dialogues, which I had the opportunity to lead over the last couple of years, to try to broaden the interest in parallel to the official negotiations, and to do this with non-governments. And I once again want to recognize that I was able to get sufficient funding from Pew Charitable Trust to bring these about. So we had a round table at Tongji University, in Shanghai back in 2015, where we started saying, what are the issues here? What should be done about this? A second meeting in the Korean Polar Research Institute, KOPRI, and then a final working session last December in Hokkaido University. And what these roundtables did was to begin to focus not so much on the what that needs to be done from a science point of view, but the how. And coming out of this, which I pulled together in a report which I can make available through the organizers, key outcomes. The argument that there should be a standalone organization to coordinate the science in this area because of the 10 signatories. Be interesting to see how this plays into the work that's going on in the Arctic Council. And several important points. A focus on indigenous involvement, which I found really quite not only astounding, but very refreshing, coming from non-Arctic countries that do not have Arctic indigenous populations. Equal involvement of all signatories. This is the high seas, this is not our EEZs. And a focus on the ecosystem, not just fish. And I refer back to the diagram that I had earlier of the integration of the ecosystem. Goes way beyond fish. So these are the principles. What would the mandate of such an organization be? Be a platform, be a small group to pull things together, determine priorities for research, facilitate planning, and so on, and analyze and interpret, but not to do science. That is being done by the agencies and organizations around the world. I'm going to be totally chauvinistic and blatant. If such an organization is created, I think it should be housed in Canada. Anyway. All right, my conclusion is what I started out with. I think it's impossible there's an agreement soon. And if so, this, I think, will be a major, major example of how to do things right. My friends and I say thank you.
Thank you, Peter. For providing additional information about these plans. And where do you have a suggestion as to where this standalone organization may be physically located?
So I have a problem hearing. What?
Do you have any thoughts about where will such a standalone organization may be physically located?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it would be extremely small. We're not talking here about a great big new organization. I've suggested that it could be hosted in Canada for two reasons, several, but two in particular. One is the government of Canada is beginning to reinvest significantly in ocean science, particularly through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And secondly, later this year will be the opening of the High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay in Nunavut. And so there are a number of circumstances which would lead to that. Canada already hosts Pisces, and so we've got experience in doing this. We also happen to have a lot of Arctic, and therefore a lot of interest. We have platforms that will be important, especially the icebreaker. So, as I say, I'm chauvinistic, but I think that would be a good place to do it.
Thanks. There's an online question. I'll go first with that in case there are others in the audience. How will it be determined when there is sufficient scientific basis upon which to consider opening a fishery? Peer review? And who will make that determination?
I'm not involved in the negotiations. I'm sort of in parallel and so on. That is one of the key questions. What are the decision rules that relate to this agreement? Who will decide what proportion of the 10? The balance between the Arctic 5 and the non-Arctic states? And secondly, what will be the threshold, if you will, for making that decision? I think it's a critical question that has been raised, but it's one that is clearly on the table in terms of moving forward.
Thank you. There's one back there first, and
Hi, good morning. Great presentation up here.
Hello.
In your deliberations, have you talked at all about enforcement and enforceability of any such agreement that you might arrive at in the future?
Absolutely. And clearly one element of enforceability is the role of flag states. So that if, for example, the signing of an agreement by China, Korea, and Japan, and so on, there would be the expectation that they would, in the first instance, control their activities. This has been a big issue in the Southern Ocean, and Korea in particular has been quite roundly criticized over the years, and is now very sensitive to that and wants to do the right thing. Starts with that. The other thing is, this is the international area, but your country has significant ability to know what's going on in the Bering Strait. And I would assume that the ability to use the existing thing that we've been hearing about would help in this. And secondly, the increasing use of satellites to monitor would be able to do that. But clearly the question then of sanctions and so on is something that needs to be worked out, and I've not looked at that.
Thanks, Peter. There are a couple of other questions, but hopefully they can be taken
Okay.
off.
Thank you.